2.
2. Chris. The topic we will be discussing today is: how do you handle big combat scenes in your tabletop RPG?
Hello and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rao.
And Andy, we are back this week with a normal episode.
This feels weird, Chris. I'm gonna be honest. This is a little weird.
Yeah. We're not, I guess, done with the summer of experiments necessarily, but we thought we would take a break from them briefly to go back to our normally scheduled podcasting, I don't know, grooves, like we're back on our back on our old stuff. But yeah, so we did want to start by talking a little bit about what we did the last couple episodes. So we played The Ground itself. So if you listen to those episodes, you can go back and listen to them. But yeah, if you haven't, we played through this game called The Ground itself. It's this world building game. We played with Kyle Latino and Amber Seeger, and it was really fun. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but I wanted to give us a couple minutes to reflect on it now that it's been a couple weeks since we actually played that. Andy, what have you thought about The Ground itself since we played it at all?
I have, and I have kind of a bigger question for you about The Ground itself. And it goes all the way back to one of our early experiments at the beginning of the summer, Sports Are Just Numerology. Both of those games were a type of game that was pretty new to me. I'd been, aware of their existence for a while, but I'd never really played one. And they are games that really eschew the normal kind of individual character-focused role-playing style that the vast majority of role-playing games use. So those games, I think we both agree, were really fun to play. But I'm curious, for you personally, to what extent are those games fun in and of themselves? And to what extent do you want to hook them up to like a more traditional RPG experience and kind of use them to inject some additional context into a traditional game?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think there's a tendency for people who play tabletop role-playing games to look at those as the start of something rather than a means, like just the game itself, right?
Right.
Right. It's like you use it as a way to set up your campaign. And that is, I will admit, that's how before playing those games, that's how I was thinking about them. Is like, oh, it'd be really cool to play The Ground itself so I can see like how it would work for running a campaign like that. But then after playing it and after reflecting on it a little bit, like, I don't know if I want to do that necessarily. I mean, I think I do. I think I still want to try it, but I'm really appreciating them as experiences in and of themselves. Yeah, so thinking about us playing The Ground itself, I really liked just how that game was. And I'd be perfectly happy to not go back and revisit that setting that we created again. But I mean, we also could too. But yeah, to me, that felt like a more of a complete experience rather than like, the start of a long campaign.
So I had a very similar approach to them in that I thought of them mostly, and I still kind of do. It's just the way my brain is wired at this point after so many decades of D&D. And I tend to think of them as this would be a great way to kickstart a campaign or to flesh out a campaign setting or something like that. Mm-hmm. But I was really impressed, especially with The Ground itself. I was really impressed by the depth of the rules. The game design was great, and it was more subtle and interesting than I realized when we first started playing the game. And I would say it was not until like the second half of the game that I realized like how cleverly it was structured to really shape the story. Like when we started, and I don't mean to be down on it in any way, but when we started, I assumed it was kind of just like a gussied up like brainstorming like sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like a brainstorming exercises with a few rules and things like that to nudge you in the right direction. But it was quite a bit more than that, and I mean it's a pretty respectable piece of game design in itself. So that kind of shifted me out of that like, oh, this is mostly useful as a way to like set up my traditional game, and it kind of made me appreciate it. Like, wow, this is like a great piece of game design in and of itself.
That's fascinating. So like, if you were to play it again, would you approach it differently? Like that first half of it?
I think so, but I will say there was kind of a joy in not really knowing where it was going and not having a real understanding of the rules beyond the immediate, like, okay, what do we do next? There was something funny. It kept me from like metagaming, or trying to be overly clever because, I didn't know how it was structured. So I would approach it a little bit differently because I would be aware of kind of what it's trying to do a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I think it's a game that plays really well, not thinking much beyond what is the next step that we have to do. What's the next die we have to roll, you know?
Yeah, there's that like the short game and the long game in this, right? Like, so there's that. I think if you had an idea of where you wanted it to end up, it would really cheapen the individual actions.
Oh,
that
100%, yes.
Yeah, because if you were trying to guide it towards something, like, I mean, it's just, you could do that. It just wouldn't be very fun. It's a terrible way to tell that story. And that's a criticism, I think, of a lot of these games that can be levied, is if someone comes in thinking that, oh, wow, I really need it to be, I need it to do this exact thing, and I need it to kind of hit this end point. Yeah, like, you start making decisions, like, aiming towards that, rather than opening up and seeing what happens. Like, I mean, I think before we played that game, there was nothing in that I could have predicted, right? Like that.
Yep. Oh, totally.
That we'd end up with. Yeah, and that's the magic of it too. Yeah, like Amber said something really fascinating, I think, at the end of the second episode. So she just mentioned offhand, she's like, we just built a dungeon, is like, that's how she sort of thought about it too. And I wasn't thinking about it in those terms, but she was right on, right? Like, there's just all sorts of like fascinating little tidbits and stuff that we put into that. That if you were running a game, you could go back and draw on those as well. But again, right, like, none of them were, like, you don't pre-plan those. Right? It has to come out of the group that you're playing with. I want to play that again, and I want to play it with different people too, and just sort of see what else shakes out of it.
That leads to one other thing I wanted to note about the experience of playing it, and that is just that being creative is hard. Like, it's hard work, and this is not a criticism of the ground itself specifically, but it was stressful is not quite the right word, but that's a game that puts you on the spot a lot. And I felt put on the spot a lot in the same way that, like, when I'm playing Band of Blades or other games like that emphasize improv in the moment versus planning in advance. It's a situation, despite, you know, all the time I've spent running games, I have come to be pretty accustomed to kind of a role-playing experience that asks for improvisation periodically, but that has big stretches in between where I'm not really having to come up with anything too creative, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
And this ground itself feels like part of a kind of a trend in games over the last decade of pushing that kind of improv, relax, be creative, come up with ideas on the fly stuff to the fore of the game experience. And that is exhilarating. But I won't lie, it's also a little exhausting sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was at least 1 or 2 points in that game where I just had to say, any ideas, anybody, because I was just out at that, you know.
Yeah. I mean, like, I have the luxury of, like, you know, like, so I edited those episodes, so going back and, like, listening to it again, like, I could sense those points where we all hit that wall.
Yeah.
Too, right? You know, so, like, I mean, yeah, like, you record the thing, right? So, like, and then you think about it, and then you get to go listen back to it, and, like, with a critical ear and stuff, right? So, like, I've heard this a lot, but, like, yeah, there were points where every single one of us was just like, I don't know what to do in this situation. And the game gives you, like, a release valve, I think. Like, there are some other stuff that you can do, and you can even just say, like, hey, I skip my turn.
Yep.
Like that as well. Like, it's sort of the equivalent of, like, I swing my sword again. Like, that's what I'm doing this turn as well as last turn. Yeah, because I just need that break. But, you know, I wonder if a game like that would be served well with having some sort of, like, do this if you're not sure. Like, you know, like, a very explicit, like, if you are tired and you just need to not think this round, like, yeah, answer these 3 questions in this order. It'll be a little bit easier for you, or, like, just say this thing, or, like, roll this die, or, yeah, because I think, like, just skip your turn, that feels a little like you're letting everybody down. But if you had some sort of fallback option, like I'm creatively burned out at this moment option.
I agree, and the game does have, you know, some mechanisms built in for that, but those mechanisms still require you to be a little creative, so it wasn't quite the respite that you might have. So.
Yeah, I know there was a moment in there, and we won't recap, like, every card in there, but I think Amber decided to throw a party, and then all of a sudden it was like there's these other rules that go along with a party. You know, so you know, we were trying to use it as an out at that moment, and it's like, it turned out that no, that wasn't an out. That was just a totally different exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's good. I do wonder too that we kept a pretty good pace, again, because we recorded and stuff. I think if I were to play it again, I would intentionally slow it down. So rather than trying to hit 2 hours, I might just say, look, this game is going to take 3 hours, and we're going to take 2 breaks, and we're going to have a little bit more time to just joke around or do other things.
Yep.
While we're playing it. But yeah, so I'm hopeful I'll get a chance to play it in the next couple weeks or so.
Please report here on the podcast if you have a chance to do so.
There's not a chance I won't. So
yeah, I know. There's no avoiding it. Hey, I had one other thing before we jump into our topic. And
oh yes, please.
So this one requires just a tiny bit of backstory. So I recently I took a road trip with my kid to the Gettysburg battlefield, and that was a fantastic experience. And maybe being a role-playing obsessed idiot, that's at least 10% of my brain at all times is like thinking about the implications of what can I bring from this experience into like an RPG.
Yes, but something deeply wrong with you. Yes.
Listeners, I hope I'm not the only one who does this, but whenever I go anywhere, I always, we get back to the motel and you're like, all right, what game stores are in the area? Let's see. So in the town of Gettysburg, there's a little miniatures and war game shop. They had a collection of used games. The used game I noticed was an old 1981 game from SPI, a very famous war game publisher. And it looked like a licensed game based on the Dragon Slayer movie from 1981, which I've not seen it.
Okay.
It looks
I'm Googling this right now.
If you Google it, it looks like, imagine fantasy movie 1981, and then whatever popped into your head, that's what it looks like. So,
this looks rad.
Yes,
I can only assume that it is based on the poster. Yeah, so if you haven't Googled this yet, like there's a guy with a cool lance, and there's a dragon.
Yes.
In the Dark Ages, magic was a weapon, love was a mystery, adventure was everywhere, and dragons were real. So anyway, are you about to tell me this was not a good movie?
Well, I haven't seen it, so okay. I have my hunch about the quality of the experience, but at any rate, so I found this old game, and so SBI clearly got the license to this like movie that they hoped would be a license to print money, and they published a board game. So I'm looking at a photo of the board game, Chris, and I'll just have to describe it. First of all, this was like in the 1980s. So there's like hundreds of words of copy on the cover of the game because at that time people believed, I guess, that you read marketing copy. And I think you and I both worked in marketing in our adult jobs, and we know that if you can get it down to like 3 words or less, that's really ideal. So on the board game are a series of little blurbs boasting about the contents of this game. Okay? So, Chris, you're publishing a dragon-themed board game in 1981. What are the blurbs, like the little phrases you're going to boast about that your game has that are going to get that 1981 teenager to plunk down cash for your game?
I mean, it's going to have to be like something like relive the magic of the movie.
Okay.
Or... I mean, the movie poster, like, dragons are real. Like, I think I would, definitely have to have that splayed, like, across the top. Like dragons are real and you get to kill them.
Yes. Okay. That's a big theme on the cover of this game. So some of the practical things they boast about are, easy to learn rules of play. All right. That sounds good, right?
Yeah.
17 by 22 inch full color map of Land. I like that. I'd buy a game with a color map of Land.
Yeah.
100 adventure tiles. Like, that sounds pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
And so there's one more thing that it boasts about, and this is what it is. 6 different dragon situations.
Dragons. Okay.
So, So, Chris, your task and our task together is we're going to make a D6 table of dragon situations. Okay? I'm going to fill out the first one already. The first one is our kind of generic, the dragon is menacing the village from its lair that's full of gold.
Oh, okay.
That's your classic dragon situation, right?
Yeah.
So, Chris, what are some other dragon situations you could find yourself embroiled in?
I just want to take a second and say this is amazing. But also, I want to ask you, Andy, would you ever want to see a dragon? Like, say that dragons existed. Would you want to see a dragon, or is that just like a...
You can revoke my D&D nerd card after this.
Yeah.
I don't find dragons to be especially interesting as creatures.
Okay.
I mean, I have a kid who is obsessed with dragons for 5 straight years of their life and didn't read anything that didn't feature dragons, didn't draw anything that was not a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't find dragons all that inspiring. Beyond, on the face of it, they're kind of cool. They're like dinosaurs with wings, which is cool, right? But I don't know. So, of course, I would want to see one.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't love dragons the way that maybe other D&D players and fantasy gamers. And
you're not going to get a dragon tattoo, is what you're saying.
I do not have a dragon tattoo. I don't have a shirt that has like a full print of a dragon on it or anything like that.
I'm going to have to get you one of those pewter figurines of like a dragon curled around a crystal ball with like a wizard. Yes.
Please do.
Okay. Don't tempt me. All right. So my dragon situation is too many dragon eggs.
Oh, okay. All right. My dragon situation is one of the members of the king's court is a dragon in disguise.
Okay. I like that. Is it like extremely obvious? Is it a dragon that's wearing a little I don't know, like glasses and a fake mustache?
It's like a 25-foot tall person. No, I imagine in D&D and elsewhere dragons can polymorph, so I imagine that it's probably disguising itself as a person, but that's part of the mystery. Yeah. I don't know.
There's this one guy who doesn't talk in the king's court, and we're not sure why he doesn't talk.
And he breathes fire when he coughs or anything like that.
Yeah. It's just I'm trying to think of other dragon situations. I think so I have a young daughter, so a lot of the dragons that show up in her books, they're comical of some sort.
Yep.
Yeah, they're cowardly or whatever, there's a stand-in for emotions. A dragon has broken both of its wings.
Oh, all right. Okay, here's another one. The world's last dragon is the only thing old enough to remember the detail you have to uncover.
Ooh, I like that.
That's when I think about it. I mean, a dragon situation, if it were like a tactical situation, it would be the dragon is dive bombing right towards you.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it'd be Rain of Fire. That's a dragon situation. Which I think that movie actually rules, if I'm remembering correctly. There are, so in the kingdom, there are too many dragon slayers for the number of dragons.
Ooh, that's okay, perfect.
All right, so the D6 dragon situation, which I assume that you will all be using in your next campaign.
Yes,
the dragon
in fact, you have to by listening to this podcast. You are contractually
legally required. Dragon is menacing the village. Too many dragon eggs. There's a dragon in disguise in the king's court. There's a dragon with 2 broken wings. An old dragon is the only being left alive that remembers a piece of information that you need to know. Or there are too many dragon slayers for the number of dragons in the world. These are all pretty good. I'm curious what the actual dragon situations are in the Dragon Slayer board game. Did you look?
I have this no, I didn't. I have this bad feeling that it's the dragon is in space A9 instead of A8.
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm not going to look and try and find out because I want to imagine that game that I did pass on purchasing it. It was priced as a little too rich for my tastes, but I would like to think that there's 6 just amazingly different dragon related experiences that you can have when you you lift the lid off of that box.
Yeah, 100 tiles, 6 dragon situations. It is probably a space where it's in different spaces or it has some sort of different treasure.
Yeah.
It's a red dragon or a blue dragon,
it makes me wonder, not having seen the movie, is what situation the dragon is in? Is that important in the movie?
Maybe. I mean, it could be one of those Clue style movies where there's 3 different endings.
I guess so. And someone comes in every 10 minutes and is the dragon situation has changed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a specific enough phrase that you really do wonder. But yeah, we should shift to our topic at hand, which might actually be, this could be a good segue, right? Because it's how do you handle big combat scenes, and if there is, like, in a fantasy style game, if there is a bigger combat scene than facing off with a dragon, I'm not sure what it is.
So, Chris, let's hear, what's the biggest combat scene you've run? And define big however you want, but tell us how you're defining it. Like lots of enemies, or just one really complex encounter?
I think I will go with the kind of complex and lots of enemies. So the one that I remember that sticks out, and I'm sure I've talked about on the podcast, was at the beginning of Horde of the Dragon Queen. There's like a siege happening on a city, and the adventuring party arrives, and they have to kind of decide what to do from there. The game that I ran that with, the party was a higher level than what they were supposed to be for starting that adventure. So I think they were like 5 or 6 or something, and it was designed for level 1 or 2. So they rolled up to this city that was getting attacked by like kobolds, I think mostly kobold, and they were like vastly overpowered for this. So they just ran through, and just anytime they came across 10 to 20 of these kobolds, they would just wipe them out like immediately, right? Like, so it ended up being a really fun setup, right? So because then the limiting factor for them was more like time rather than could they win at different battles, right? Because there was 5 or 6 things happening throughout the city, and it was up to them to decide what did they want to do before they tried to take on like the entire army, right? Like, how would they kind of sneak around and stuff like that. But yeah, so the way that I ran that was with more like, I don't know, like squad based tactics. I'm not sure what they're like, mob tactics. So rather than it being like each individual kobold had 6 hit points like that, it was just sort of like a group of them, right? Like, so you're taking on 10 of them, you do a certain amount of damage, and take away 5, 5 or 6 of them like that. But it was really fun. It was really snappy. They could just like use their powers and just sort of walk through and destroy things as they were going along. It made them feel very heroic, like that. So that was probably the biggest combat scene that I've ever run, and I'd say it was fairly successful. There was another one towards the end of that specific campaign that maybe wasn't as successful, even though I tried to do some similar stuff. But yeah, that one was good. Yeah, what about you?
2 things spring to mind, and they're kind of 2 different types of, quote, big combat encounter. One, many years ago when the RPG Savage Worlds first came out, one of its big selling points was that it ran mass combat really quickly compared to other games. And so you didn't have to be afraid to have like a whole horde of zombies. It would go fast enough. It wouldn't bog down the way it would be in D&D if you had to fight through a whole bunch of zombies with 17 hit points. And so I decided to test that out, and I ran a scenario with like a gigantic horde of zombies, and I didn't use squad tactics because I was trying to find out if Savage Worlds really could do this, and it did work okay. I've run a few encounters like that in different systems where it was like just a very large number of opponents milling around on the field. But the other type of big combat encounter I've run, and one that springs to mind, is like the just really complicated, demanding combat encounter. And there's one I remember, I guess appropriate for our earlier discussion, was at the end of a big adventure, and there was a dragon in its lair. The lair had like kind of a lake in it, and the terrain was difficult and challenging. And the players knew going in exactly what the situation was. They knew there was a black dragon down there. They had some idea of its capabilities. They understood the terrain. That was one of those situations, where everybody is scrutinizing all their spell descriptions and checking their equipment and everything like that to get every little bit of mechanical advantage they could, making a plan for, you cast this on the first turn and I'll do this move on the second one, and then you follow up with your special ability, And so that was a big encounter, and it took like the whole night to resolve, and it was fun and satisfying, I guess. So So I guess we've just described big combat encounters that were pretty fun. We've hit on the different ways that DMs use. There's some of the different ways the DMs use to tackle them, right? There's fighting that dragon. It's like this minute tactical experience using every combat rule in the book. And then you described something where it's a little bit more abstracted. They're going around on kind of like a squad level. What is your tipping point where you're like, I'm going to stop using the D&D or whatever rules as written here, and I'm going to like zoom out a little bit and bring in some sort of like more abstracted system for this fight.
For me, it is when there are so many of like the same type of enemy that it just becomes not interesting to track each individual one.
Yeah.
Right. So like if you have a bunch of named characters, right, like that doesn't call for abstracting it. But like if you have 30 kobolds, right, like, and the idea is more that it's an overwhelming number rather than like an interesting group of enemies, right? Like that's when I would zoom out, because it's like it's a foregone conclusion that like one-on-one your heroes would win every single time, no matter what. Like even your wizard could draw a short sword and run, like and take out that kobold. Yeah. So like if you're at that level of like disparity sort of in like power level at that point, then to me it makes sense to like let's take a step back and sort of do something a little bit different.
One of the things I struggled with like early on in running games was that D&D and other games like it seemed kind of artificially They kind of artificially limited combat to that like small scale, suitable for a small party of adventurers scale. Mm-hmm. And my young logical mind was always bothered by like dungeons where you would move from area to area, encountering whatever stuff was in each room without the entire dungeon getting word of what was going on and coming at you with like, an alliance of 40 different creatures. And of course the reason for that is because that's not fun, except maybe as a occasional like deliberate change of pace. But it reminds me a little bit of that action movie cliche where like you're facing a bunch of enemy minions or something like that, and they could swarm. If all 20 of them swarmed the action hero, it would be over. But instead, they come in and fight him at exactly the scale the hero needs them. So one at a time. I don't have any grand point here except to say that kind of artificiality of scale has always irked me. It always irked me a little bit about the way your typical like dungeon-y role-playing games are set up.
Yeah, I think that to me has always been bothersome too. And I think to the point where whenever I'm running a dungeon, I'm reminding players like, you got to be quiet, so you're going to alert everybody. Like, sure, you can do that, but like there's other rooms and stuff, or like just making sure there's doors between everything. But it's like, it's a little like silly. It's like if like the room next to you right now, like if an adventuring party broke into your house and started like attacking, I don't know, like your pets or something like that, like you wouldn't just wait in your room until they entered, right? Like you'd come and like figure out like what's going on, like that. I mean, maybe from the other end of the house, but even then, like I don't know, like there's just lots of stuff that I think you have to not think about too hard when you play some of these games. Okay, like so we both jump sort of like to D&D and like those styles of game. I'm wondering, like with Band of Blades and stuff, have you run big combat scenes in that? Like with Blades in the Dark, I know I haven't. It's always very much like a one-on-one sort of thing. There's something about like those systems that I think actively would discourage you from doing sort of a big gang warfare.
So yes, I have, and I'm glad you brought this up.
Okay.
So like larger scale combat is a feature of Band of Blades, because you're a military unit, and it's expected that like half your encounters are going to be a platoon or two's worth of guys fighting an equal number of monsters. And I will say I really don't like bad mouthing games, because I always assume that at least some of the fault is mine. But for a game where this should be expected to happen a lot, Band of Blades is incredibly hand-wavy about how you handle like scaling your fight up from a couple of dudes fighting a troll to a couple of squads fighting a couple of squads of zombies. To date, I have mostly just made it up. There's like 1 or 2 pages in the rules that give some like kind of hand-wavy advice. And I don't know, maybe someone who knows the system better or who better understands how its mechanics work would probably laugh at me and just point out how I'm doing it wrong. But I would say Band of Blades has not solved that scalability issue especially well. Although, as with any game, it's perfectly possible to use its mechanics, to scale. You just have to think on the
Mhm.
fly to do it.
Okay, so like you just went to Gettysburg, right? Like, so when you
Yes.
think about like military battles, I'm not a military historian like at all. Like, that's just not how my brain works. But my understanding is, right, like you can look at them at different levels, right? Like you can look at a military battle at like vastly different levels. Like you can just look at the like, hey, who won, total up the number of like, people lost on either side.
Hmm.
You can zoom into specific like skirmishes that were happening, during that battle. Like you could probably even get down to like a what did one individual do during that battle as well. It's all the same thing, right? Like I think this is like what Dunkirk, right? That movie like plays with this
Hmm.
exact thing. Yeah, so like when you're thinking about like Gettysburg, and I know you've shared just some specific stories about stuff that's happened that like I didn't learn about in school. Like it's really fascinating to hear about these like individual things that were happening. And I'm wondering if like when we're thinking about big combat scenes, like why can't you kind of zoom in and out and, and have
Yeah.
have sort of all those things happening? And like should that even be a function of a game to like be able to tell that story of a combat scene at those different levels, or is it just like you're just stuck with like, look, like you're an adventuring party, so we are going to tell the story of you going through that battle, not the high level?
It's a good question. And, I think D&D-ish games proceed on the assumption that what your characters are doing is the most interesting and most influential and
Yes.
pivotal part of the battle, right? I think D&D would generally say you don't really want to scale out beyond the level where you are role-playing your individual characters' reactions and experiences in the fight, right? Because that's probably what drew you to D&D in the first place, was the chance to role play a person,
Mm-hmm.
doing these exciting things that you can't do in real life. So I think with a lot of games, there's a risk that when you kind of zoom out, you lose that connection that everybody has to their character. You lose your set of eyes on the actual ground, and that's got to be at least one of the reasons that certainly there have been attempts over the years to add kind of a operational level battle system to D&D. But
Mm-hmm.
those aren't successful or popular as far as I can tell. I think role playing games are just biased towards whatever else is going on. You guys are the stars of the show, and that's why I don't know how other GMs run it, but when I run a big battle, if the PCs are fighting in like a giant Gettysburg sized battle with tons of people, my instinct is to have the momentum of the battle be somewhat flavored by, or even determined by, how the PCs are doing in their very individual skirmish on the hill with those goblins.
Yeah, that makes total sense, and that's exactly what I've done. It is making me wonder, as we're talking about it, like how fascinating would it be if like the tide of the battle was opposite to how the party was doing.
Yeah.
Like if it was just like everything is getting worse, even though it looks like you're doing great right here, right? Like so the party puts their head up after they feel like they've just killed the mini boss and stuff, and then they look around and it's like, oh, like we biffed it. Like this is going terribly. Or even on the other hand, like what if there is something else interesting happening? Like what if like they're fighting and then off in the distance they see like a fireball come out of nowhere? Turns out there's another party that's also fighting this. Like you're not the only magic users and stuff. Yes, I mean like there's some opportunities there, but yeah, I don't know. Like it's hard to take them too. I don't know if you should.
One of the other challenges, I think, and again, talking D&D, but of course, apply this to other genres
Yeah,
and styles
of
as
course.
you will. D&D invests a lot of its design energy in figuring out how all of its powers and stuff like work on immediate punching range like scale. And it works
Yeah.
well, and it's been honed to do that really well. What would a battle in which you might have like a whole company of spell casting elf wizards or something like that? I mean, it would get weird and crazy,
Mm-hmm.
and it would require as much design love and attention to make that work well and be balanced and be interesting. That's a lot of energy to make that work, as well as the real tactical focus does. And so I don't know, another reason I think that people are inclined to just abstract out that bigger stuff. So drawing on my visit to Gettysburg, you do lose something of the unique character of a battle when you are zoomed all the way in to that level of like just fighting over a few dozen square feet of ground.
Mm-hmm.
A battle like Gettysburg was all about understanding the terrain and which places needed to be held, or the whole battle would be over before it started. When you're just playing on one small battle map's worth of terrain, you miss some of that, like, slightly more strategic picture that brings character to a battle like Gettysburg, which is defined by those, like, strategic level features like Little Round Top and the different ridges and things like that.
Which that makes sense. It's like, because like, it doesn't make sense, right? Like, war is awful, and like just thinking about the human aspect of Gettysburg, like, kind of like breaks my brain a little bit.
Yes.
But like thinking about it, right? Like the actions that people are taking in real world battle are more finite than they might be in like D&D, right? Like, so you might have like 10 spells and a couple different cool weapons and stuff, and everything's like all varied and interesting and stuff like that, versus like just keep reloading your musket, right? Like, and try to walk forward as much as you can. Like, that's a very different like set of abilities to give players. And I think if you were to, so like as soon as you give them the ability to like, oh, also you have spells and stuff, then it's like, okay, well, that's fascinating. Like, let's like play with those.
And what you find also, again, thinking Gettysburg, because I was just there, like you said, the skills that win you a battle, are different than the skills that win a knife fight with kobolds. The skills required to be victorious at a battle like Gettysburg or fill in any other battle were the ability to keep moving when you're exhausted, the ability to like keep your morale just high enough that you're willing to follow orders, the ability to just do what you're told, without question, just the ability to endure through a terrifying and exhausting and dehumanizing experience. In the Battle of Gettysburg, I mean, I guess, did it help if you were like a crack shot with your rifle? Yes. But, nobody was up there like sniping like crazy and winning the Battle of Gettysburg with their plus 15, shooting skill,
Yeah.
People won the Battle of Gettysburg by like sticking it out and not running away. And that's a different type of skill than D&D and its cousins are interested, and it's a more depressing, it's a depressing type of skill.
Yeah.
It's inspiring in its ways, but it's also depressing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the power of fantasy at the heart of these games, is like that one person can matter.
Exactly. Yeah. But at Gettysburg, all 25 of you and your platoon mates or whatever matter, but like one of you did not matter that much.
So going back to the other concept of big combat scenes, right? I want to touch on that a little bit before we wrap up, right? So like, we've talked a lot about like, how do you do like a massive battle with a lot of people? So you had mentioned like a somewhat complicated like fight with a dragon where there's a lot of preparation and stuff beforehand. And I think like that's probably where D&D and its ilk are a little bit better suited to do, because like that's the sort of simulation that it wants to do. Like you just mentioning that reminded me like of one of my favorite encounters that I've run, just was with a dragon, and like they were a little bit too low of a level to be facing off with a dragon of any sort, and I even think it was like a young green dragon. It was just really fun to play this scene where the party was so outclassed unless they were being savvy about it. It was very different from, we've entered a room, there's some sort of new monster, we know we have to kill it. Like, it was like, we're gonna have to talk to this thing, we're gonna have to reason with it, it's smart, it's savvy, it could kill us at any moment. Like all sorts of these other things were going into it that were different from other stuff. I'm wondering, like, when you're running a campaign, do you try to intentionally put those combat scenes in? Or do you let them emerge as the players are coming up with ideas and plans?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I don't know if this is not gonna answer your question exactly, but we've talked a lot about the negatives of lots of combat in D&D. Mm-hmm. Every other episode we probably gripe about this, but
most likely, yeah.
But the combats that are rewarding are the ones that require the players to master the game system to wrest victory from an overwhelming situation. You described a battle where the players are kind of the underdogs, and I think there's a real joy in D&D in a combat encounter where you have to like scour the the details of your spells and your feats and your special abilities to use every advantage you have to beat the game at its own rules, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I think that is exciting. I think you are right when you say that at its best, like, D&D combat really shines when you have players that are super engaged with the rules of combat and are using the game's systems in exactly the way they're intended. I think you and I both don't often run games like that. I don't know about you. You know, I'm pretty loosey-goosey when it comes to like combat rules. You know, because there's real downsides to saying, okay, everyone, we're going to do this by the book, and I expect all of you to be well versed in every rule on your character sheet. There's some real downsides to that, and so there is this system that me and a lot of DMs I've played under. You know, you just are a little hand wavy on the combat and the details of it, and that works well, I think, and that's why people do it. But sometimes it is nice to say, okay, for this one, you guys are going to have to like bring out every rule advantage you can find.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a game that you and I both played in like a month or two ago with Tim Saucer, who's been a guest on he ran a really lovely game in the Cypher system, but the last big combat in it, I kind of like keep thinking about and going back to, and it was just this fascinating, like we had been playing for quite a bit that day, and it just felt like we all sort of figured out like what our characters could do in that combat.
I know exactly.
I would say like more so than before, and it was really cool. And like he mentioned it too. Like it was a neat moment for him to see like how we came together, and specifically one player, Aaron, who's also been on the podcast. Like he like just used everything at his disposal to change what was happening in that battle. Like he just like he went through all of it, expended all of his resources, well, most of them, right, to get the result he wanted. And it was really cool to see a group latch on to the rule set that much, and even like in character too, like making all these decisions using everything that we had available to us, because we sort of like also knew that it was the end of it, end of the campaign at that point too, so there's no sense in holding back. But yeah, it was really fun, and that's something that kind of can't happen if you hand wave stuff all the time. Like you never get that opportunity to really be like, you know what, like no, like we're going to use everything here, like, and GM, sit down, like we're going to ruin your plans, or not ruin your plans, but like we're going to make this specific thing happen. So, to Tim's credit, right, like he let it happen even if it might not have been exactly how he wanted it to go. And I know there was even things within that, there's like some player friction and like all sorts of just cool stuff like happened at the table. It doesn't happen unless you set up that big combat, and it doesn't happen unless you allow people to interact with the game systems in the way that they need to let it happen.
A lot of these fights we've described are the fights that happen at like the end of the campaign, right? All the ones I've described so far in this podcast have been the final culminating fight of the game. I think it's not a coincidence that we're not talking about skirmish with orcs in room 14 of the dungeon. We're talking about, the final showdown. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think there's something special, and D&D really shines when you can use all of those tools on your character sheet and in the rules, and you can pull out all the stops. Like that battle you just described, one of the things that was so fun about it was, in watching Aaron, he spent, like you say, pretty much everything that his character could do. He expended it because we all understood this was it. This is the big battle. There was no point in saving anything. And I think that D&D-ish games, have this very familiar structure of lots of not very important combats and encounters that are designed to like whittle down your resources and tempt you to waste resources that you really should be saving. And that is a neat, that is a good system. It works. And it's like has this at least mild plausibility to it. But sometimes it is kind of a shame. Like, why isn't every combat just like a knockout, like just throw everything you got at this thing, because the bad guys are doing the same, maybe that would be too much, but we do complain on this podcast a lot about combat being boring. Is one of the reasons that like players are incentivized to try and eke through combats with like the minimum possible expenditure of abilities, items, and spells.
Yeah, they're rewarded for not for not doing that. So, yeah.
Something to think about.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fascinating point. We should wrap it up, but like, yeah, I mean, it's of course making me think, as it always does, like, well, why not figure out a way to run D&D where you can use your cool stuff every time? Yeah, just like, okay, you will be getting a long rest after every single combat, so do what you want.
Right, exactly.
That.
Yeah, and listeners, yes, you've just heard us relentlessly complain about how long D&D combats are, and then basically say that every combat should be like a 3-hour final showdown. So
yes, no matter.
We live in the tension of that contradiction.
Yes, no matter. All right. Well, this was really good. Yeah, it was fun actually getting back to doing something on the table. Although we're of course like probably immediately not do something on the table, but we'll see what comes next time we record. Yeah, Andy, do you have any other sort of parting shots on running big combat?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered everything anyone would ever possibly want to hear me say about big combat. So.
Yes, that's true. Yes, someone out there is doing it right, and they're yelling at their podcast player at the moment. Like, why don't you just? You know what? And we actually live for that. So if you have any good ideas about how to run big combat, of course, let us know. Yeah, our email addresses are published on the internet, which is maybe not a great idea, but they're there. If you want to find them, please reach out. Yeah, and we do just love hearing from people in general. I know it always brings a smile to my face when someone mentions like, oh, hey, I was listening to your podcast, and it's like, oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Because we do it to be listened to. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, good conversation. And it is fun to get back to the table topics. I imagine we have some more experimental stuff coming up, but this was actually kind of a fun reminder for me that it's sometimes fun to roll on that table and just talk about what it forces us to discuss.
Yes, yeah. All right, well, let's wrap it up there. I have been Chris Salzman.
I've been Andy Brow.
And remember, if your players are having fun, you're a great GM.